oh, my closet door is open. I was looking for something to wear, and I picked out a red shirt, and then I realized it was 7 o'clock, and I gave up and said we're going with the purple hoodie that I hope isn't stained too much. It's a casual day. Okay, so let me walk through updates. Here's what happened. Here's what's going on. I had So last week, I was just completely exhausted. I wrote the newsletter on Friday. It went out on Saturday. A lot had happened. We're still in the middle of a book launch. Just many things are happening across everything that I'm involved in. And um, I just, by Friday, I was just exhausted. I was just completely done. I took Saturday totally off. I just hung out, all this type of thing. I kind of very quietly did laundry, and hung out a little bit on Sunday and got through laundry, got things folded, got ready for the week, did this, schedule and all this type of thing. And I woke up today actually feeling really great and really refreshed. But I just wanted today to be really quiet. It's 45 degrees here. It's cloudy. It was raining last night. Great sleeping weather, but that's why I slept so well. Great sleeping weather, all this type of thing. But I was really just in the mood for quietness and just having a chance to just have an easy day. I'm very lucky this week. I don't have any podcast recordings. Actually, I remember one on Friday, but that's okay. Don't have any podcast recordings today. It was totally free. This was the only thing I had to do today, and so I had time to work on my new book, America's Lost Generation. I got 50 pages done. I had a chance to, eat and just kind of relax and hang out. I did some content stuff and some admin stuff and business stuff and all this type of thing. But it was just I wasn't like, oh, I have to jam 50 things in before this meeting or this call or whatever have you. So I've just kind of been enjoying a very relaxing day, which is why, my whole wardrobe plan for this episode just went off the rails. Because I was like, oh, it's 6. I was on the phone with somebody. And I'm like, oh, it's 6. I need to get ready for the news hour. And I had some content stuff to do and emails to go through because I've been editing on this book for 2 hours, so I hadn't touched anything in hours. Did all of that, and then I realized, oh, it's 6:59. I need to start the show at any moment, and literally in the middle of that, I had to install a new version of Ecamm. I had to install a new version of my stream controller, Loop Deck, because there's a new plugin and all this type of thing, which also required an update. So I'm kind of doing all of this in the last 2 minutes of being on. And it was just crazy. And so in all the hubbub and everything, did I get a chance to change my shirt? No. So not a yellow hoodie. It's a purple hoodie broadcast. But I hope you don't mind. Purple for me has always been a very attractive color. Anything purple I will buy and wear because it always works for me really well. Same thing with red. I always wear very bright, vibrant colors. I don't do beige and gray. A lot of black though, but I don't do beige and gray. So that's kind of the update of me. It's been a quite interesting and crazy week in the news. We're going to be talking about some trade war stuff, some globalization stuff. I am going to jump right into the stories on the Cato Institute. I did not get to last week because we kind of ran out of time. Sometimes people will say, oh, you should just go longer or cover that story. And it's like, yes, sometimes I do, but I really, really try to keep this to an hour. Because I realize time is precious. Not everybody has a ton of time. And so I really try to keep it, sort of short and all this type of thing. I know a lot of these political shows, like Hassan Piker streams for hours a day, and Pacman does 3 hours, and everyone's always doing all these, and I try to keep it short, sweet, and to the point, and try not to extend so far beyond. Although today I have a feeling we are going to go a little bit over an hour, because there's a lot of very interesting stories and very interesting things happening. I did enjoy over the weekend the video of Trump walking Elon's son out to Air Force One, and everyone kind of clowning on him as the first babysitter, or Elon has gotten Trump to babysit and all this type of thing, or pays attention more to Elon's kid than his own children, kind of Tiffany Trump, eat your heart out. So Yeah, that was most entertaining, but the weekend was relatively quiet. One of the big stories was the deportation of Venezuelans to a prison in El Salvador. Um, and I saw some footage today of them putting them through the new revamped, very austere and brutal El Salvador prison system, which is, near as I can tell, some combination of prison and boot camp. And also there was a court order against that deportation, and it still occurred. So, constitutional crisis maybe. Yeah. So that's kind of where we are um this week with things. It's been a busy week, but this week's gonna be much more relaxing. We have a lot happening in the news. So on that note, enough of me just talking on. Let's turn to the headlines. So let me do not that, this, here we go. And and we're not gonna watch any videos, so we'll mute that. And here we are. Alright, so I wanna start right in with this article from the Cato Institute, and it's entitled, let me go scroll to the top real quick because we can jump back down. It's entitled The Misplaced Nostalgia for a Less Globalized Past. The subtitle is The Great Again Economy Wasn't So Great. Americans have traditionally been optimistic about the future, but a strain of thinking across the political spectrum today seeks to recapture a time when life was supposedly better for most Americans. And boy, oh dear Lord, do I need to clean my glasses at some point. We'll do with that later. But I wanted to read this because never in my life, as someone who's been part of progressive and leftist politics for 10 plus years, did I ever think I would be reading an article from the Cato Institute to promote something that they were saying, because they are a right-wing think tank. But this is where we are. I think, let me start from this before we get into this article. We're gonna dash down here. A lot of us on the left were always very disappointed with the undermining of unions, the offshoring of jobs, the degradation of the American economy, and how that had affected people's and worker salaries and lack of wage movement and all this sort of thing. And that was part of Bernie Sanders, was part of Occupy, where have the good jobs gone? Books have been written about this, all this type of thing. And sort of out of that discussion, which started on the left and not the right, it started on the left, was this idea of the economy is not working for the everyday person. Now, that's something, in fairness, Trump dialed into in 2016 and is ridden all the way through. That's a subject that the Democrat Party has never really addressed beyond, oh, we should have more government subsidies, more social safety nets, all this type of thing. The Democratic Party has very rarely talked about the kind of root of the problem, which is enriching the profits of shareholders in the 1%. Now, Bernie Sanders will be the first to complain of the 1%. But that's as a rhetorical device, that's not something you hear the Democratic Party talk about a lot. Hillary didn't talk about it a lot in 2020. Kamala Harris didn't talk about it a lot Hillary didn't talk about it in 2016. Biden didn't address it in 2020. Kamala Harris didn't talk about it much in 24. Biden also didn't talk about it much in 24. It's not been something that's been rhetorically used. Trump, on the other hand, has definitely used it. And his tariff regime and trying to protect American industry economy from open and free trade, which has been the policy of this country basically in some form since 1947, is kind of the culmination of that. Now, knowing all of that, one might think, well, hey, this could be good for the everyday worker, protected jobs, bringing manufacturing back, all this type of thing. But there are downsides to not being open to free trade in terms of sacrificing growth and all this type of thing. Now, some people would say, I don't care if the GDP goes up if my family's not doing well. Fair point. But with all of that in the back of our minds, let's get into This from the Cato Institute. Now, some of this will be interesting, some of it will be enraging, including things said in paragraph 2, but let's read a little bit of this. So, this section is the rising tide of globalization has lifted all sizes of boats. Critics of globalization may acknowledge that millions of Americans have indeed benefited in recent decades, but they say it has come at the expense of rising inequality and the stubborn persistence of poverty. But here too, the past 4 decades of rising globalization have witnessed real progress against poverty and no overall increase in inequality and living standards among Americans. Let's talk about housing and healthcare. See what I'm saying? It is the Cato Institute, so let's remember who's writing this, but we're going to get there. In The Myth of American Inequality, Graham, Eklund, and Early show that the official poverty rate understates the gains of lower-income households because it suffers from the same inflation mismeasurement that taints the official wage and income data because it omits major government transfers. After properly accounting for inflation and federal, state, and local transfer payments, they found that the real poverty rate in America fell from 7.2% in 1979 to 2.5% by 2017. Meanwhile, research from economist Bruce Secredote found the incredible consumption gains for poorer families between 1960 and 2015. In particular, he found that American households with below median incomes not only have more cars and bigger houses than their earlier era counterparts, but their overall consumption, adjusted for inflation, increased between 62% and 164% over that period. Thus, poorer Americans today can consume about twice as many goods and services as their 1960s counterparts, thanks in no small part to globalization. And here's why that is. Because we moved manufacturing overseas, so goods became cheaper. And the things that we couldn't outsource and send overseas, housing, healthcare, education, the big three, obviously have gone up a lot in price. And a lot of those those three will save your life, and give you opportunity for the future. And so that, so yes, but then the counter to this also is cheap goods the only part of the American dream? If you can't afford a house, if you can't afford healthcare, if you can't afford educational opportunities, all this type of thing, what good's a cheap TV? What good is any of this if you can't find a job to buy any of it anyway? And so that's kind of where these arguments begin to break down. However, to their point, the reality is a television no longer costs $3,000. The reality is that a lot of the things that used to be, relative luxuries are a lot cheaper. I saw this great TikTok over the weekend that said one of the reasons why boomers don't understand the financial issues of millennials is that when they were young, life was cheap, but luxuries were expensive. So housing, transportation, healthcare were cheap. So it's like, okay, spend your money there and you won't have luxuries, but you'll be okay, sort of thing. Well, now it's reversed for younger people, for millennials and Gen Z. Now it's life is expensive, housing is expensive, education is expensive, healthcare is expensive, but luxuries are cheap because we were able to outsource those, reduce the cost of labor, and reduce the price a great deal. That was kind of the trade-off of globalization. This goes on. Official inequality figures reflecting the widely used Gini coefficient suffer from similar problems. After adjusting for taxes paid and transfer benefits received, Graham, Eklund, and Early found that the Gini coefficient has actually declined slightly, i.e., U.S. society has been becoming modestly more equal in our era of expanded globalization. Since the 1950s or 1970s, the adjusted Gini coefficient was on average 0.3443, or 0.3412, and 0.3384 in 2010 to 2017, the most recent period available. As the authors conclude, over that entire post-war period, greater transfers to lower-income households, combined with steeper taxes taken from higher-income households, have more than offset the rising inequality of earned income. That's true among earned income, but when you start getting into interest, capital gains, corporate taxes, all this type of thing, this begins to kind of fall apart. They then have a cool section about manufacturing, which we're not going to get into right now. However, there are other kind of interesting things. They talk about America's more liberalized economy delivers in other more important ways. It says Americans are also better off today in ways that are not directly captured by wage, income, and consumption data. For example, workplace safety has steadily improved in recent decades, with the rate of workplace deaths down 30% between 1992 and 2017, and the rate of workplace injury and illness down 69% over the same period. A safer work environment has not only been driven by safety improvements within specific workplaces, but also by a broader shift in work from heavy industry to more service sector jobs that are inherently less dangerous. Women have joined the workforce by the millions since the 1950s and fill a much wider range of occupations, not only because they're better educated and find less discrimination in the workplace, but also because they've been freed from time-consuming tasks at home by all those modern appliances that have become available and dramatically more affordable in our modern, more globalized economy, i.e. dishwashers, washing machines, stuff like that. Life for racial minorities has also significantly improved since the 1950s. As shown in Figure 8, for example, the poverty rate for black Americans declined from approximately 55.1% to 19% between 1959 and 2021, after accounting for consumption and transfers, of course. This improvement would be even better. The share of low-income black households fell from about 55% in 1967 to 37% in 2021, while the share of higher-income black households increased from 4.1% to about 22% over the same time period. Hispanics have made similar progress since the 1970s, and while only 4% of Americans surveyed by Gallup in 1958 approved of interracial marriage, 94% do today. As the website Human Progress documents, an American born in the mid-70s has over his lifetime experienced significant long-term improvements to life expectancy, infant mortality, food supply, education, and environmental quality. Gains since the 1950s are even larger. Death rates from cancer in the United States fell by 32% between 1981 and 2019, saving 3.5 million lives. The United States has also experienced substantial gains in both air quality and water quality since 1970. And as this points out, that has much to do with this right here. A shift in work away from heavy industry to more service sector jobs and jobs that are inherently less dangerous. Just keeping that out there. They conclude that when we consider the progress that has been made in the past 50 years in living standards, equality in household consumption, worker safety, and opportunities for women, the nostalgia era for a less globalized past is difficult to understand. As Graham Eklund and Early summarized in their book, in short, by virtually any physical definition of economic well-being, working Americans across all income levels, race classifications, education levels, and other commonly used statistical classifications are substantially better off today than they were in 1972. If Americans want to extend and revitalize the kind of progress we've enjoyed since the 1970s, the answer is not to turn back to a more protected and regulated U.S. economy, but to promote policies that open the U.S. economy to more domestic and international competition and more choice in the marketplace for U.S. workers and families. I think the problem is what jobs are the people going to do to pay for those things? What do we do about the cost of housing? What do we do about the cost of food? What do we do about the cost of living in this country? And the downside of this article is, despite all the good sides of all of this, and they spend a lot of time touting all of that, there's never any mention of that. It's quite difficult to tell someone, yeah, you can't afford housing, yeah, your car payment is too high, yeah, the price of food is all of these things, all this sort of, inequality, but the rich are getting richer, and we're doing well. Even this graph up here at the top, which shows goods imports, which obviously fell in 2009, but also, and goods exports, are obviously less. They were more tied together in the 70s, and then you can tell China, in the 80s they start to separate, and then through the 90s it gets a bit narrow again and then starts to widen again. You can tell right when China joins the WTO right here, because then exports go down a lot, and then they start to climb back up just whenever the recession, and then you have this sort of peaking again, but it's still a big delta between, imports and exports. And then you have service exports and service imports are much closer together, because that's the stuff we're good at. And it also shows American investment abroad and foreign investment and all this sort of thing. Obviously, that was the pandemic there. And so it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. And I think part of their point is correct. in terms of, yeah, in many ways life is better. But until you address the things that people really need, until you address the basic needs of existence and all this sort of thing, it's going to be hard to make the argument that a more globalized economy is helpful when houses are too expensive, apartments are too expensive, and nothing is, affordable for the average person. So I wanted to bring this article up because it brings up a lot of good points about how things have improved. And there have been improvement gains. We have much nicer lives than we used to. I get that. But the flip side, and I think where MAGA's coming from, is yeah, but everything's gotten too expensive, so now we need the good jobs with the good wages to pay for those things, bring costs down, all this sort of thing. That's kind of where the economic tension is. I think the interesting part is while this conversation started on the left, it's now been entirely co-opted by the right, as oftentimes happens. And of course with much more success, because the right usually addresses these issues with snappy slogans like Make America Great Again, while the left issues policy papers. Messaging issue. Alright. While we're at the Cato Institute, I wanted to talk a little bit about immigration, because they post this other article as part of their 13-part series on globalization then and now, and it says U.S. immigration policy lags behind a globalizing world. The immigration that the United States has permitted or failed to prevent is the only reason the labor force is not yet declining. And it says it has many sections, but this is kind of the interesting part. Precisely because fewer U.S.-born workers are entering the economy, immigration critics are correct that immigration has never played a more important role in labor force growth than it has today. From 1995 to 2022, immigrants accounted for 49% of all civilian labor force growth, and immigrants and their children accounted for 70% of total labor force growth. During that time, the civilian labor force grew by nearly 33 million, and immigrants and their children accounted for nearly 23 million of that increase. Numerous occupational categories were even more dependent on immigrants and their children for growth. Immigration skeptics might counter this data by suggesting that native workers would be better off in a U.S. labor force that had fewer immigrant workers. Contrary to the restrictionist narrative, however, American workers benefit from immigrant workers filling needed positions. On average, additional workers produce more than they consume, so they cause economy-wide prices to fall relative to a world without them. Immigrant workers increase the productivity of firms, creating demand for U.S. workers in complementary positions. Companies respond to more labor availability by investing in more capital, which increases workers' productivity, preventing any decline in wages or employment. Consistent with the theory, the ratio between capital and labor has been increasing consistently for decades. Immigrants also allow U.S. workers to shift towards better paying, English language intensive jobs and liberate lesser skilled U.S. workers from more manually intensive jobs. According to Chapter 4 of The New Americans, Economic, Demographic, and Fiscal Effects of Immigration, immigrant consumption spurs demand for workers throughout the economy, meaning that immigration causes no net decline in employment among U.S. workers. Increasing productivity of firms increases tax revenues that fund transfers to U.S. workers, while also increasing the value of retirement savings and investments. Immigrants contribute more in taxes than they receive in benefits, subsidizing transfers to U.S. citizens. Labor force growth is also essential to economic growth. More workers increase production and innovation and spur businesses to invest in capital. According to an estimate calculated in a 2019 paper, immigrants in 2022 directly accounted for about $3 trillion of U.S. GDP. Skilled immigrants account for a disproportionate share of innovation, with a 1% increase in immigrant college graduates translating into an increase in patents per capita of 9 to 18%. Indeed, skilled immigrant workers increase innovation, accounting for as much as 40% of total factor productivity growth. Now, that's their argument. When it comes to policy, they then come down here and say, why is the United States falling behind in attracting immigrants? The basic answer is that the United States has a very restrictive legal immigration system. The basic structure of U.S. immigration policy, which has remained virtually unchanged since the 1960s, permits permanent legal immigration from abroad by only a narrow set of categories. The refugee program, which the government selects which refugees can apply, it took about 25,000 in 2022, and 0.2% of those refugees are recognized by the United Nations. The diversity visa lottery, family-based immigration, and employment-based immigration. The selection rate in the diversity lottery has fallen about 90% since the first worldwide lottery was held in 1995. Meanwhile, the lottery, family, and employment caps were last updated in the Immigration Act of 1990. The family-based caps have spawned a backlog of more than 8 million applicants, up from about 3 million in 1990. The only reason legal immigration did not flatline after 1990 is because spouses, minor children, and parents of U.S. adults and parents of adult U.S. citizens are exempt from the caps. But for 2 decades since 2001, the total number of new legal permanent residents has remained stuck at about a million. This flow contributed just 0.3% to the U.S. population annually from 2013 to 2022. This is far below the rates of legal immigration commonly seen in the late 19th and late 20th centuries in the United States, when annual new legal immigration exceeded 1% of the U.S. population 20 times, the equivalent of more than 3 million immigrants today. Because the green card or permanent immigration system has become so dysfunctional, the temporary worker programs have become vital lifelines for employers and workers. But again, outdated caps also dictate the numbers. The H-1B program for workers with at least a bachelor's degree in a specialty occupation received 780,884 registrations for 85,000 visas. The median H-1B worker has a wage offer of $100,000 in the top 10% of U.S. workers nationwide, meaning the H-1B cap is costing the United States tens of billions of dollars in production annually. And when I read that and I saw this graph and all this sort of thing, I thought it was kind of interesting because my thesis for immigration has always been you can solve a lot of illegal immigration by having a robust legal immigration system, and we've never had that. When I was in middle school and early high school, I was in a debate club, and immigration was a hot topic at the time because the Bush administration was in. They had taken immigration nationalization, which is now ICE, and folded it into Homeland Security, and it was a big change. But a lot of stuff wasn't updated, like these caps and everything. And so my idea at the time was we just simply need more more legal immigration pathways. I also, as a debate subject, which everyone thought was absolutely crazy, when I was 13 years old, I said if we wanted to stop illegal immigration in Mexico, we should build a wall of concrete. I have lived long enough to watch my crazy idea at 13 years old that everyone laughed and made fun of me about literally become a thing that President Trump wanted to do, which I think is hilarious. So, and if that gives you an idea of where Trump's at on immigration, I came up with his plan when I was 13. So, the finish off is that almost every aspect of employer-sponsored immigration is choked with costly and time-consuming bureaucratic hoops. Employers must deal with a half dozen government agencies, list them all here, and potentially also USCIS's Fraud and National Security Directorate and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The standard procedural processing times now exceed 3 years for an employer-sponsored green card. The risks and legal costs have to make it too expensive to even attempt to use these programs with the caps to not even end up with a worker. So here we are with this kind of, difficult situation, re-immigration, re-everything, and how, it's not like we've just thrown open the doors to anybody. We definitely have not. It's a lot more complicated than that, for better or for worse. So somebody just called me, and I will call them back. They are an important person, but I will call them back later. So I went through all that to say that I still think that our solution to illegal immigration is a more robust legal immigration process. That's not necessarily always a popular thing or idea, but it still remains an important one. So, speaking of immigration, I wanted to get into the latest in the immigration saga, which is that the Justice Department is defending the Trump administration's deportation flights, telling a federal judge his oral order is not enforceable. We're going to come back to this thread in a minute. We're going to jump over here and learn what happened. So, a little drink. The Justice Department made an extraordinary argument to a federal judge today that an oral order he issued during a court hearing Saturday afternoon is, quote, not enforceable, unquote. The Trump administration is defending itself against accusations that it violated an order to hold off on carrying out deportations of some migrants whom the U.S. had accused of being affiliated with the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua. The argument, submitted in a 6-page filing to U.S. District Judge James Boasberg shortly before a hearing on the issue, is set to get underway later today, and argue that an oral directive is not enforceable as an injunction. Written orders are crucial because they clarify the bounds of permissible conduct, Department of Justice attorneys told Boasberg, an appointee of former President Barack Obama and the current chief judge of the federal trial-level courts in Washington, D.C. Though the judge's order from the bench said any planes in the air carrying some of those migrants must turn back to the U.S., his brief written order contained no such language about planes, and instead just said the administration was enjoined from removing individuals while the temporary restraining order remained in effect. The narrower written order may well represent a more considered judgment by the court about the proper exercise of its powers, the attorneys wrote, referring the judge's order that was posted shortly after he announced his decision from the bench. In accord with this well-established law, the written minute order governed. The court's written injunction, which issued approximately 7:25 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, properly did not seek to interfere with the President's Article 2 powers to conduct military operations overseas by directing the return of aliens associated with a designated foreign terrorist organization who had already been removed from the United States territory, even though the written order did memorialize other narrower oral directives from the hearing, the DOJ wrote. Boasberg ruled that the hearing will proceed at 5 p.m. Eastern as scheduled, rejecting the DOJ's request for a delay. And we'll see if they have it here what happened. Nope, it doesn't look like it. Here's the update. What happened? These weren't statements, this was an order, Boasberg said during a hearing in Washington. He summed up the DOJ's reasoning as, we don't care, we'll do what we want. The hearing has concluded. Well, that's what happened with that. It didn't end well. So, just wanted to, this has been a very big story today, and I'm gonna bounce back here real quick and say that I found that the comments here, like this one, no judge should have the power to order a plane to turn around mid-flight that endangers travel and is illegal. Says who? A judge doesn't have the right to counteract the entirety of the executive branch. Their job is to interpret law, so if no injunction has been brought, they can't just impede the executive branch's duties. That's abuse of power on the judge's part. No, that's literally their job. Open the schools. Like, we need to teach civics again. It's depressing, and the big I think top line view of this is that if the Trump administration continues to want to violate court orders like this and go against what judges are doing, we're losing an important wall against some of their more dicey actions, which means we will live in a country where you cannot go to a court to seek relief for something done against you. There's no process for justice. And that means the powers of the federal government and the power of Trump himself goes basically without end. And if you don't find that frightening, I can't help you. I can't help you on that one. Speaking of international stuff, I wanted to move on to this story. This Saturday, the Trump administration cut funding for Voice of America. And this is kind of about that. It says that when the Voice of America staff arrived at work on Saturday morning, they found they had been locked out and could not access their email accounts. Radio stations in remote corners of the world that had depended on VOA for decades suddenly went silent or turned to playing music. The message was clear. America's voice to the world had been silenced. Let's examine why this matters far beyond the halls of a government agency you never thought much about. It says here, on Friday night, Donald Trump signed an executive order targeting U.S. Agency for Global Media, USAGM, the parent organization of Voice of America, as well as Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, and other U.S.-funded media networks. By Saturday morning, the agency's newly installed advisor, Carrie Lake, yes, that Carrie Lake from Arizona, had placed nearly the entire Voice of America staff on administrative leave. Other agencies received notices that their grant agreements with the U.S. government were being canceled. I am deeply saddened that for the first time in 83 years, the storied voice of America is being silenced, VOA Director Michael Abramowitz wrote in a social media post. Nobody, including me, and I'll mention up front that I've done projects with both Voice of America and Radio Free Europe over the years, would argue these agencies couldn't be improved. But this wasn't merely a budget-cutting exercise. It was a self-inflicted wound, a deliberate dismantling of institutions that have been projecting American values of press freedom and democracy since World War II. Nothing says America first, quite like pink-slipping 1,300 journalists who literally export American values for a living. The networks aren't being gutted for spreading radical propaganda, as President Trump has claimed. They're strategic assets that have advanced American interests and values for generations. Voice of America was launched in 1942 specifically to counter Nazi propaganda. Radio Free Europe helped pierce the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. Radio Free Asia has exposed China's persecution of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. These networks reach 420 million people in 63 languages across more than 100 countries. Consider what happens when they go dark. In authoritarian states like Russia, Iran, and North Korea, millions lose access to reliable information about the outside world, including accurate reporting about the United States. As Stephen Kapus, president of Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty, put it, the Iranian Ayatollahs, Chinese communist leaders, and autocrats in Moscow and Minsk would celebrate the demise of RFERL, Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty, after 75 years. Global press freedom is at its lowest point in decades, according to Freedom House. Disinformation campaigns flourish across social media. As the European Commission warned this weekend, in an age of unmoderated content and fake news, journalism and freedom of press are critical for democracy. The vacuum won't remain empty. Russia spends billions on RT, formerly Russia Today, China pumps resources into CGTN, and Iran funds Press TV, all state propaganda outlets designed to extend their influence and undermine democratic values. Without American-backed alternatives, these voices will dominate airwaves and digital spaces in many regions. And it goes on to why it's a gift to America's adversaries, and this point is good. Russia has designated both VOA and Radio Free Europe as undesirable foreign organizations. North Korea has reportedly executed citizens caught listening to Radio Free Asia. Chinese state media has celebrated the moves against Radio Free Asia, which one state-controlled journalist labeled one of the U.S.'s most insidious anti-China propaganda outlets. When your policy decisions earn rave reviews and dictatorships, perhaps it's time for some soul-searching. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to people, when it comes to Radio Free America and all this type of thing, one, this is a story I want you to be aware of. I don't necessarily have a lot to say about it, other than to say, Voice of America has been used for propaganda in the past. It definitely presents a certain point of view that tends to support whatever the current government is doing. It has definitely been a way for America to export its values and its own unique point of view, perhaps to the detriment of other points of view along the way. But I also understand kind of why Trump is getting rid of it, because I think for him it's not just a budget-cutting exercise, it's also indicative of the pullback. We're pulling away from the world, away from its problems. We don't need to export us and our values and all this type of thing. And we don't need to, kind of be there every day with this new sort of thing. And let's also face it, it's a great thing for autocrats around the world. But I think it's also indicative of this whole idea that it's not, I think in Trump's view, it's not our job to counteract these other countries or these other regimes, but to let them go on and exist and do what they do as much as we do what we do. And that is a radical departure from the American-led liberal order that we have been living under in international relations for a while. And I think it's honestly very indicative of what I think the future of American foreign policy is going to be, is if it's not affecting us directly, we don't care as much. And we don't feel the need necessarily to win the globe to our side. We don't feel the need to embrace the planet and try to inculcate them in American values. And I think that is probably a really big change. Will it matter to the everyday American? Probably not. But in terms of foreign policy and international relations, it's a very big change, and one worth talking about. So, I also want to stop by, let's not do Colmbia yet. Let's do that first. So, Um, Speaking of Trump's economy and the tariff regime and economics, which we've kind of talked a little bit already with the Cato story, um, we have this interesting article from the Telegraph in the UK that says that Trump's game plan for devaluing the mighty dollar attempts to boost U.S. exports, risk undermining the foundations of American exceptionalism. Now, here's the sad situation. This article, when I first found it, was behind a paywall. I think I signed in to to read it, and it's now still behind a paywall, and I knew that, but I wanted to post this picture in this headline so that I could mark talking about it. Basically, what the article kind of surmises um, is that the whole kind of idea is that what Trump really wants to do is he wants to make the U.S. dollar radically cheaper so that U.S. exports become competitive again because the cost of American labor is so high. And so what he wants to do is he wants to keep interest rates low, keep money flowing into the economy, and allow the dollar, which actually globally is very strong against most currencies, to really devalue. In the past, when currencies were more regulated, countries would do this from time to time so their exports wouldn't become uncompetitive. Britain was notorious of doing this in the 70s for devaluing the pound in very set ways. Before a lot of countries brought on the euro, there was local currency devaluations to keep currencies cheap. This was particularly true for countries like Greece or Italy that were dependent on tourism, where they needed their local currency to be cheap so tourists could spend a lot of money. Trump is trying to do the same thing, and what he wants to do is raise tariffs so that we're importing less and we are exporting more, and the only way that system is going to work is if you devalue the dollar by keeping interest rates low and printing a whole lot of it. And so I think his hope is that that won't drive inflation, but I think it will. So I just wanted to post an article for the lovely picture and to mark it that this is what we were talking about here, and trying to do this currency devaluation. The problem is currencies aren't fixed anymore, so you have to play the currency market. So you basically have to get investors to decide, things are kind of going down, and to start, trading the dollar lower so that exports become more attractive. The problem is if your demand for US dollars raises, i.e. people are demanding dollars for trade, then the dollar gets stronger. I think what Trump is hoping is that if we're importing less, the demand for dollars will go down, and the price of the dollar, our currency, will then devalue because we're making more at home. This will take years to accomplish, but I think this is where he's going for, and this was an article that explained it very well. And now I've explained it to you. Let's talk about Colmbia. So this was a hot topic of conversation over the last week, and on Friday, Friday a week ago, the Trump administration announced that it had canceled $400 million in federal grants and contracts to Colmbia University, an extraordinary step it said was necessary because of what it described as the school's failure to protect Jewish students from harassment. Columbia's interim president, Katrina Armstrong, said in a university-wide email on Friday night that the school is taking the administration's actions seriously. Colmbia is, quote, committed to working with the federal government to address the legitimate concerns, she wrote. The announcement escalated the administration's targeting of Colmbia, where protests last year over the war in Gaza set off a nationwide debate over free speech, campus policing, and anti-Semitism, and led to similar demonstrations at schools nationwide. The move also represents the latest in a series of attacks by Trump-aligned Republicans aimed at elite higher education institutions following last year's congressional hearings that resulted in the departure of the presidents of Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania. It comes after recent executive orders barring diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at all educational institutions that receive federal funds. A warning issued Monday by Linda McMahon, the newly confirmed Secretary of Education, made clear that the administration had its sights set on Colmbia. Ms. McMahon warned that Colmbia would face the loss of federal funding, the lifeblood of major research universities, if it did not take additional action to combat anti-Semitism on campus. Dr. Armstrong, the interim president, said Colmbia was going through a, quote, time of great risk to our university, and that the cutoff of government funds will be felt in nearly every corner of the school. Quote, there's no question that the cancellation of these funds will immediately impact research and other critical functions of the university, impacting students, faculty, staff, research, and patient care. A statement issued by 4 federal agencies on Friday announcing the funding cuts referred to ongoing protests and anti-Semitic harassment at Colmbia, though to what extent pro-Palestinian demonstrations on campus can be considered anti-Semitic remains in dispute. The statement said the cancellations represented, quote, the first round of action, and that additional cancellations were expected to follow. More than a quarter of Colombia's $6.6 billion in annual operating revenue comes from federal sources, according to its 2024 financial statements. The National Institutes of Health gives the most federal research money to Colombia, providing $747 million in 2023. An additional $206 million came from Health and Human Services. Because grants span multiple years, Colombia holds more than $5 billion in federal grant commitments, according to the federal government. While the university's large endowment can help to plug the funding gaps, it is not clear if the school will use it for that purpose. The endowment was almost $15 billion at the end of the last academic year, according to the figures published by the school. The school also faces 3 federal investigations into allegations of anti-Semitism on campus that have been announced over the past several weeks. Now, I want to stop here quickly and explain kind of how university endowments work, because there's been some question about that. University endowments are not necessarily chunks of cash lying around for the school to use at will. A lot of these grant programs fund specific faculty, program, research, care, clinics, all this type of thing, and it's quite a chunk of change. The first problem is you cannot come up with $400 million overnight. That's why about 2,000 people got laid off this weekend at Colmbia. 2. You have to go to the board of the university and look at the rules of the endowment and the bylaws and what funding is available. Some of an endowment is pledged money from people who pledge to leave money when they die. So they don't even have the money yet. That's the other thing. Also, on top of that, you do not necessarily have access to all the money because some of that money is endowed, not just for the perpetuity of the institution, but for specific programs, scholarships, all this type of thing. So this statement that the university's large endowment can help to plug the funding gaps is kind of accurate, and the board also has decided to spend that money. Here's the problem with endowments. Once you spend the money, you have to go re-raise that money, and you can't spend it forever. It's a finite resource. I was in an institution that had spent through its endowment, and trying to keep that school open without that money there was definitely incredibly difficult, and that's actually school ended up closing because of that, due to mistakes that have been made over decades. I don't think Colmbia is in danger of going under, but when your budget is $6.6 billion and you lose a quarter of it overnight, even with an endowment of $15 billion, you can't fill in that gap forever. And let's also not forget, that's just this year. What about next year? And the year after that? And the year after that? At some point, those chickens come home to roost. Even with Harvard at $50 billion, which is the largest of endowment, I think, in the country, for a non-state funded school sort of thing, even they have the same restrictions, the same problems, and can't necessarily come up with money overnight. I also don't believe you can borrow against it either. So you have to collateralize a loan or anything with real estate, and you also have no revenue to pay off that debt, and your institution now has a huge debt bill. So the reality is that when government cuts off funding of these institutions, a lot of people get laid off. A lot of programs have to come to an end because they were entirely funded by the government, and there's not necessarily a secondary funding source right there that can be used to fill in the gap. Let's lay that to one side. Now, picking up the other side of the Palestinian protesting anti-Semitism, there were aspects of those protests where Jewish students were getting attacked and were getting barred from going to class that was not right and was not good under any circumstances. There was no reason for those students not to be protesting. They should have been protesting loud and proud for their cause. That's what the university's for. The Jewish students can walk another way to school, go right on by, look at the protesters, but be on their way. Not stopping students from attacking Jewish students was wrong. And that was a tremendous oversight by the university, and they should have done a better job of making sure that Jewish students at least could safely get by the protests going to class, because those students don't have anything to do with this. They're not in government in Israel. They're not in government in this country. They're 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old, just going to class trying to live their life. students going after them just for the ethnicity is, well, quite frankly, racist, kind of by very definition. And unfortunately, this country has lots of instances of anti-Semitism, and that's always wrong. I'm mindful of the synagogue shootings. There were a pair of them several years ago. This week, the interview on the podcast is Ronnie Robbins, whose father, his family was killed in the Holocaust, and he had a lot of guilt because he'd come to America and he escaped, but the rest of his family did not, and her family got a lot smaller. So, and that's the interview this week. So this is all very prescient. So anti-Semitism is never wrong. No one should ever be abused or attacked for who they are ethnically. That is not the mark of a civilized society. But a marker of a civilized society is loud and frequent protests on things that we think are wrong. And I think Colmbia should have done more to preserve both of those things because they're part of a civilized society. I heard a comment. Well, yes. I mean, let's talk about that. Oh, I had this articles up and I had the wrong, I've been talking and I've had the wrong thing up. Here we go. That's much better. And let me address this comment because I heard a comment here. Yes, plenty of videos showing the same happening the other way also. I don't see anyone being sent back to Israel. Well, they wouldn't be sent back to Israel, of course, because they're American citizens, naturally. The protests at Colmbia definitely got a lot out of control. They definitely did. I mean, let's be clear. They got out of control. More should have been done to make sure both voices were heard as part of having civilized protest discourse on this matter. The kids I felt sorry for were the kids who had nothing to do with either side and either of the protests and just wanted to go to class. They should have been, more could have and should have been done to allow both points of view to be expressed in a safe and civilized way. That is the point of the university. Last week when I talked about this, I told a story. We were talking about Mahmoud Khalil, who's been disappeared, because this is another ongoing saga of this story, where I talked about the abortion protesters when I was an undergrad, and what we had to deal with that. And we were in no way protected from the terrible things that they put up on campus and all this sort of thing. But I told that story as a cautionary tale of there is a way to handle protests, there's a way to handle these things, in an equal and fair way. I've been to protests where there's been side A on this side and side B on this side with a line of cops going down the middle. That's an acceptable situation. Having areas where things are happening and you have, signs and actions and all this type of thing happening is fine. That would have been a better way to handle it. The point being is that Colmbia got out of control for this. Now, do I think the federal government, through the Trump administration, should be punishing Colmbia for that? Absolutely not. And I think it's a terrible, terrible thing that the Trump administration is doing. They are hurting people, killing people, ending careers and lives unnecessarily to serve their own political agenda. And that is 110% wrong every day of the week and twice on Tuesdays. So, let me move on from this story. Although the comment that it is not being applied equally, no, it's not. I mean, this is where the federal government should not be punishing institutions for not dealing with the protests. That is certainly true. And we also, we kind of understand why politically this is not palatable to people. And there's, like I said, the Republicans have had, a hard-on about this, especially when it comes to Colmbia and the Palestinian protests since last year when they happened. Last week I had read a story from a man who was Jewish and a Democrat and wanted to know why students weren't being protected. This is a very obviously sensitive and difficult subject. Again, there's a way to do this and a way to handle this in a civilized and safe way. So, let's move on to speaking of pulling funding from groups, and this is not a liberal publication, by the way, this is the New Republic. Trump's FBI moves to criminally charge major climate groups. The Trump administration is targeting climate organizations that received a Biden-era grant. This is so pernicious. Okay, here we go. The FBI is moving to criminalize groups like Habitat for Humanity, the House People, for receiving grants from the Environmental Protection Agency under the Biden administration. Citibank revealed in a court filing Wednesday that it was told to freeze the group's bank accounts at the FBI's request. The reason? The FBI alleges that the groups are involved in, quote, possible criminal violations, including, quote, conspiracy to defraud the United States. Quote, the FBI has told Citibank that recipients of EPA climate grants are being considered as potentially liable for fraud. That is, the Trump administration wants to criminalize work on climate science and impacts. The @CapitolHunters account wrote Wednesday on X, quote, an incoming administration not only cancels federal grants but declares recipients as criminals. All these grantees applied under government calls for environmental work were reviewed, accepted. Trump wants to jail them. The Appalachian Community Capital Corporation, the Coalition for Green Capital, and the D.C. Green Bank are just some of the nonprofits being targeted. Quote, this is not fraud, this is targeted harassment. The idea of criminalizing community climate work wouldn't have originated at the FBI. It likely comes from EPA Director Lee Zeldin, who today cut all EPA environmental justice offices. All the EPA's environmental justice offices, which try to reduce pollution in poor and minority communities. Zeldin's order eliminates 10 EPA regional offices as well as the one in Washington, D.C. I cannot tell you how incredibly unfair this is. You're an organization, the government does a grant, you're like, let's apply for that grant, we'll do some great work. You get your grant, awesome, we're off doing our good work. And then the next administration comes in and says, not only are we cutting your funding, but you've defrauded us because you're working on something that we consider fraudulent due to our ideology, and we're going to try to criminally charge you for stealing money that at the time you were not stealing and was given to you in an entirely transparent way. I mean, what do you even do with that? I mean, this is misuse of power if there ever was one. It's quite depressing. Yeah, death march of autocracy. Indeed. I mean, I'm just kind of nonplussed. When I saw this come across, I was like, how can any organization in good faith, and perhaps this is the point, take a grant and then wonder, oh wait, will this come back to bite us criminally if the wrong party wins an election? I mean, that's nuts. If Democrats did this, can you imagine the GOP meltdown? If Democrats were doing this to right-wing organizations or church organizations or whatever have you, oh Lord, there would be truckers in the streets clogging the highways. I mean, it would be insane. It would be insane. The GOP, they'd be on TV every hour. On the hour. That's funny, actually. Complaining about this. Absolutely nuts. Absolutely nuts. Completely crazy. And Trump must be angry at Carter for winning his inauguration. I mean, you know what? Trump is that petty. Here's what we do know. Trump is that petty. That much we do know. I want to close tonight on an article from Ralph Nader. The man who brought you seatbelts and airbags in cars, and also who banned beef tallow. He is talking about stay silent and stay powerless against Trump's tyranny. And his idea, this is in nader.org, of course, is that people who are not speaking out against Trump are complicit in all of this. And this is kind of funny coming from Ralph Nader, who ran several third-party presidential campaigns and all this type of thing. Like, Trump's lost Ralph Nader. It says here, there are reasons why influential or knowledgeable Americans are staying silent as the worsening fascist dictatorship of the Trumpsters and Musketeers gets more entrenched by the day. Oh, go you, Ralph Nader. Most of these reasons are simple cover for cowardice. Start with the once powerful Bush family dynasty. They despise Trump, as he does them. Rich and comfortable George W. Bush is very proud of his administration's funding of AIDS medicine, saving lives in Africa and elsewhere. Trump, driven by vengeance and megalomania, moved immediately to dismantle this program. Immediate harm commenced to millions of victims in Africa and elsewhere who are reliant on this U.S. assistance, including programs to lessen the health toll on people afflicted by tuberculosis and malaria. Not a peep from George W. Bush, preoccupied with his landscape painting and perhaps occasional pangs of guilt from his butchery in Iraq. His signal program is going to go down in flames, and he keeps his mouth shut, as he's largely done since the upstart loudmouth Trump ended the Bush family's power over the Republican Party. Then there are the Clintons and Obama. They are very rich and have no political aspirations. Yet, though horrified by what they see Trump doing to the government and its domestic social safety net services they once ruled, mum's the word. What are these politicians afraid of as they watch the overthrow of our government and the oncoming police state? Trump, after all, was not elected to become a dictator. Declaring war on the American people with his firings and smashing of critical people's programs that benefit liberals and conservatives, red state and blue state residents alike. Do they fear being discomforted by Trump Musk unleashing hate and threats against them, and getting tarred by Trump's tirades and violent incitations? No excuses. Regard for our country must take precedence to help galvanize their own constituencies to resist his tyranny and fight for democracy. What about Kamala Harris, the hapless loser to Trump in November's presidential election? She must think she has something to say on behalf of the 75 million people who voted for her or against Trump. Silence! She is the perfect bait for Trump's intimidation tactics. She's afraid to tangle with Trump despite his declining polls, rising inflation, and falling stock market and anti-people budget slashing, which is harming her supporters and Trump's voters' economic well-being, health, and safety. This phenomenon of going dark is widespread. Regulators and prosecutors who were either fired or quit in advance have not risen to defend their own agencies and departments, if only to elevate the morale of those civil servants remain behind and under siege. Why aren't we hearing from Gary Gensler, former head of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, now being dismantled, especially since the SEC is dropping his cases against alleged cryptocurrency crooks? Why aren't we hearing more, much more, she wrote one op-ed, from Samantha Power, the former head of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, under Biden, whose life-saving agency is literally being illegally closed down, but for pending court challenges? Why aren't we hearing from Michael Regan, head of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency under Biden, about saboteur Lee Zeldin, Trump's head of EPA, who's now giving green lights to lethal polluters and other environmental destructions? These and many other former government officials all have their own circles, in some cases millions of people who need to hear from them. They can take some courage of the 7 former IRS commissioners from Republican to Democratic administrations who condemned slicing the IRS staff in half and aiding and abetting big-time tax evasion by the undertaxed super-rich and giant corporations. I am told they would be eager to testify should Democrats in Congress have the energy to hold unofficial hearings as ranking members of the Senate Finance and House Ways and Means Committee. Banding together is one way of reducing the fear factor. After Trump purged the career military at the Pentagon to put his own yes man at the top, 5 former secretaries of defense, who served under both Democratic and Republican presidents, sent a letter to Congress denouncing Trump's firing of senior military officers and requesting immediate House and Senate hearings to assess the national security implications of Mr. Trump's dismissals. Not a chance by the GOP majority there, but they could ask Democrats to hold unofficial hearings as ranking members of the Armed Services Committees. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker can be one of the prime witnesses at these hearings. He has no fear of speaking his mind against the Trumpsters. And he goes on for a bit, and he finishes this here where he says, Don't self-censoring people know that they're helping the Trumpian dread, threat, and fear machine get worse. Study Germany and Italy in the 1930s. The Trump-Musk lawless, cruel, arrogant, dictatorial regime is in our White House. Their police state infrastructure is in place. Silence is complicity. And I think, honestly, that sums it up really well. Oh, I have something. Let me, here we go. I think that sums up the situation very well. Obviously, everyone has been unhappy with Democratic leadership. Schumer and Jeffries are under fire right now for helping pass the continuing resolution and keep the government open. I understand why they did it. I don't like it, but I get why they did it. Because obviously the headline would be, Democrats shut down the government, and that's all Trump would say. And if Schumer came out and said, oh, but we're trying to stop Trump from destroying the government, people would just say, yeah, but you shut down the government. Like, aren't you both destroying it? Like, all this sort of thing. So, I get why they're doing it. But I think Ralph Nader's idea that former officials, former presidents, presidential candidates, all this type of thing. I know, I don't like agreeing with Ralph Nader either. No, that's the irony. I never thought I would be sitting here happily agreeing with Ralph Nader about anything. No, I understand the gravity of this moment. No, I know, it's Ralph Nader. It would be nice as a liberal, leftist, progressive person, liberal voter, to have the leaders of my movement out and loud and proud and leading the resistance as a group en masse against what's going on. But I also know that ultimately this is a defeat and surrender situation, and we're still in retreat. And I appreciate Mr. Nader's words. Never thought I'd say that in my life, but I appreciate what Ralph Nader is saying, and I agree silence is complicity. I don't know that any of them are in a position to go out and do that. The tradition always has been to kind of keep your mouth shut and not cause a ruckus. But I also know that this is the most perilous time in American history, probably since 1860, and it's time to cause a ruckus. So for once, and unfortunately, I'm agreeing with Ralph Nader. That's the crazy world that we're living in. I'm questioning everything too. I'm here agreeing with Ralph Nader. This is a terrible problem. So, it's 10 after the hour, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the news hour. I'm sorry I forgot to put up that one article. I forgot to switch camera views. Oh well. Thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. The interview this week is with Ronnie Robbins about her family's experience in the Holocaust. There's also an interview today with Christina Braver about romance books and sex and how romance books can help your sex life. So make sure to check out Christina Braver's video as well. I will see you next week. Make sure to follow me on all manner of social media at CameronJournal.com. There's a new article out today called Hacker World about cybersecurity in my new collection, What the Hell is Going On? So if you want to read about hackers, cybersecurity, all this type of thing, make sure to check that out. Sign up for the newsletter, sign up for Cameron Journal Plus if you want to get exclusive content, hang out in the Discord, all this type of thing. I am going to start having sort of after news hour hangouts on Discord, probably into the summer sort of thing, where we can talk about headlines, you can ask me questions, all this type of thing, and we can hang out and chill and all this sort of thing. So make sure to check out Cameron Journal Plus, all this type of thing, and I will see you next week on the Cameron Journal News Hour. Have a great night, everyone.